That's at least good, yeah. Thank you all for taking the time to come out today. My name's Jonathan. I work at the University of Denver and happy to come up north to the Republic of Boulder. No one checked my passport, so you know we still have some open borders between Denver Metro and you all. But no, bring greetings from Denver, where it is also sunny, and as you would expect, pretty much a similar vibe to what you all have here in Boulder. So yeah, so my plan today is to introduce the Party Institute, and that's what I have been the director of for about 10 years now. And I have a few annual reviews that I thought I would just pass around, and you all can feel free to keep them. I'll start this one around this side, just to give you a sense of some of the things we do. We are a large research institute at the University of Denver, which means to be an institute at the University of Denver, you have to do about $2 million a year in sponsored research. And that's what we've been doing more or less for the past 12 years in this space. So I'm going to start by introducing the Party Institute. I'm going to use that then to talk about the thing that really makes us unique, which is this International Futures Model. The International Futures Model, or IFS, is how we refer to it, is a tool that was developed initially starting in the late 1970s out of Case Western Reserve. That was where it started initially. It moved to the University of Denver in the early 1980s, and it moved at that point from more of a punch card space, you know, the big, some of you will remember punch cards in computing, and then more into the personal computer space, where it turned into kind of a teaching tool, a tool that was used to teach students about how to think about long-term systems development, sustainability, those kinds of questions. And then by the time we moved into the 2000s, the tool had a very broad representation of development that I'll use as a way to kind of explain the topic at hand today. And then today I'm going to be talking about SDG 9 and how we think about things related to technology transfers, reshoring of manufacturing, production, and implications for long-term global South inequality and development. And one of the things I'm going to use there is a set of scenarios that are used in climate modeling. These are, has anyone, just by show of hands, and I'll be surprised if anyone has, but y'all are going to be an eclectic, interesting audience, so maybe. Has anyone heard of the shared socioeconomic pathways? Oh, excellent. So we have, did you work at NCAR at some point? Or?
No, I worked on climate change for almost 40 years.
I see.
Consultant.
Nice. So the shared socioeconomic pathways are a set of scenarios that represent 5 different socioeconomic futures, and one of them very much looks like a world where reshoring goes awry and global inequalities really start to grow. So we can start to unpack and explore that from this model-based perspective. I'm fairly informal, so feel free to jump in with clarifying questions or just questions or comments or whatever you'd like as we go. I'm supposed to present for about 20, 30 minutes, I think, something like that. But as questions unfold, I'm going to start iterating more with the model, and we'll use the model to explore the kinds of questions that you may have in this space. Any clarifying questions or comments out of the gate? Okay. So I'm going to start with just what is Party, just to give people a sense of this. So Party, the name Party came from Fred Party. Fred Party was an analyst at Rand who got wealthy with a lot of real estate purchases in the Los Angeles area. So you'll see Fred's name on the Rand School in Santa Monica. It's now called the Rand Party School, and Boston College has a Party Institute for the Long Range Future. So there are really 3 groups that have Fred's name, and Fred gave generously before his passing. So I'm going to briefly go who we are, where we come from, what we do, and then start to dovetail into the model and start to show you the model in more detail. So who we are. Frederick S. Party Institute, we're an academic nonprofit research institute. I mentioned the kind of sponsored research volume. One of the reasons I'm going out and doing more talks, there are points in my past where I would have had to say no because we had so many projects, but this period we're going through the biggest transition in funding that I've experienced since we started. And a lot of it has to do with the UN system. I mean, it's all, you can draw a through line to Trump pretty directly, but it's the UN system, it's the development assistance world, it's USAID, it's all of those features have been kind of decimated. So we're in outreach mode at the moment. This is a kind of core staff who work at the Institute. It's a smattering of different kinds of people where some people are focused on more technical model development pieces, data gathering, data analysis. Other people do more client outreach and analysis, writing, that kind of stuff. Most people are staff. I'm the only faculty at this point. This is the history of this, and I'm not going into it to go into too much detail, but just to give you a sense that this isn't some kind of thing that I developed as a grad student that could pejoratively be called vaporware, like where it's not clear inputs and outputs and kind of what's going on. This has been a very long-term academic research activity with lots of people involved. Starting in the late 70s, started as a pedagogical tool. That's Barry, that's the founding director and the person who spent his entire career building this thing. Then we moved more into more of an active public outreach space where we did a lot of work with groups I'll explain in a moment. What do we do? So we do academic research, and it focuses in two big silos. One is related to geopolitics and international relations. So we're talking there about the rise of China, geopolitical implications of things like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the US's attack on Iran, what if China invaded Taiwan, things like this. So we do a lot of data building, and the tool that I'll show you has a lot of really cutting edge things that are associated with international relations. The other side of the house is sustainability and development. Historically, we've done about 1 million in sponsored research for both sides. The geopolitical risk stuff is still going very strong, but the sustainable development stuff has been shockingly dry for the past 12 months. So that's been a thing that we're wrestling with. I'll give you some examples of work that we've done just across some organizations. We've worked quite a bit with the UN system, UNDP. We've done a lot of work on helping them think about long-term SDG achievement. So I see some SDG pins, gentleman in the back has an SDG pin, and obviously your brochure has the SDGs right inside. So we're speaking the same language with the SDGs. So we do a lot of work with the UN system that looks at training their country offices and how to use tools like this to assess SDG attainment, and then trying to build policy strategies that help us think about what are the most effective ways that we can get to reduced poverty, improved undernutrition, etc. We also have done a lot of work on like bespoke projects. Probably the highest impact thing we've done for the UN is related to the war in Yemen. Very highly cited, read from on the floor of the Senate, a very well-traveled document that was unique in the sense that for the first time we were able to estimate how many people were dying indirectly from the conflict, and it's quite a large number. Those numbers are always really large, but it's very hard to get at good, robust estimates of what the indirect conflict mortality, not the people dying right on the battlefield, but the people who are dying because they lack access to water, sanitation, infrastructure, etc. And at the time we were publishing this in 2019, the number was about a child under 5 dies every 9 minutes in that conflict because of the conflict and deprivation. So that motivated a lot of things like regional donor conferences that changed Saudi's behavior towards the conflict in some ways as well. So you're trying to fight wars with reports, which obviously it's not an even playing field, but you are we do have examples of times that we've had some real impact in those spaces. Done quite a bit of work with the African Union as well. These days, politically, it's not as tenable. There's not so much interest in funding U.S. research institutions from an Africa-based financing space. But we've worked with them for the past 12, 13 years. Has anyone heard of the African Union's Agenda 2063? It's a big, yeah, you have? That's amazing. Not many people have, right? It's a continental set of policies that was established in 2013 that was meant to look back 50 years to the end of colonialism, when the AU says colonialism ended in 1963, and then to look forward 50 years from 2013 to 2063. So having the ability to make long-term projections and model-based kind of analysis gives people on the continent resources to help guide policy. And so this is their second decade implementation plan. So it's like continental policy it's basically the SDGs for the African Union. And the IFS tool is used to help set those. And so I can help explain like the logic behind that and how a tool like this works. But that's an example, right? And this would have things like SDG 9 characteristics. And the work we've done on the continent, there's this very persistent question about the degree to which Africa needs to follow traditional development trajectories that emphasize a shift from, you know, your primary economic sectors like ag and raw material extraction to your secondary sectors like manufacturing, where you can get real additional value add from your labor inputs into a space like that and move quickly through a development transition, a la China would have done, right, after joining the WTO, et cetera. So those are big questions. There's some people who argue that you don't need to go up the manufacturing curve and you can work on kind of what I would call, is that me? No. Okay. Sorry, this one ear is like a little plugged, so my hearing's a little off. Whether you have to go through the manufacturing curve or whether you can use like technologies like pixie dust and sprinkle it across society, which makes all sectors more productive. And so there's a really, that's kind of where I want to end the conversation today. It's like, that's one of the core tensions with thinking about whether reshoring manufacturing in the global north will have a negative effect on labor and development in the global south. So that's where we're going in that sense. But these are just some pieces we worked on with the African Union. We write books, and then let's get to the actual model itself. So this is a visual representation of the issue areas that we cover in the model. The model is free to use and open source. You can go and download it right now if you'd like. It's on the internet. Happy to help if you have questions. There's a big help system behind it. There's a lot of information that can help guide you through your journey. But these are the major issue areas that we cover. Very centrally to the work we do is we have a very elaborate representation of economic activity. So that would be everything from capital investments, government spending, savings, household kinds of spending, consumption issues, different sectors in the economy, different ways of thinking about productivity and growth and how technology is changing the resources that countries have in order to move up that development curve. So we do a lot of economic work. You really need a demographic model if you're going to do any long-term projections. So our population module is kind of world-class in terms of it meets the standards that like the UN Population Division would have, et cetera. There you're doing things like forecasting the distribution of the population, fertility, mortality, et cetera. Our health module was developed with the WHO about a decade ago, and it looks at mortality and morbidity broken down by age and sex across 15 different cause categories. So there you're looking at things like the communicable disease burden in certain countries or the non-communicable disease burden as you get aging and the implications for health spending and for pensions and government debt, et cetera. We have your kind of standard core physical systems represented. So agriculture we would represent where you're thinking about land use, you're thinking about how productive is the land, how much are people consuming, where is their demand for food, how is that changing, how are diets changing. Energy, we're looking there at things like, are we producing solar, wind, gas, coal, oil, nuclear, et cetera? What's that mix look like? How does that affect both investment, so demand for different kinds of energy types, overall energy demand, efficiency, those questions. That would, of course, connect to our environment model where you're thinking about climate change and how different energy mix patterns are going to affect your buildup of greenhouse gases and your changing patterns of temperature, precipitation, and downstream effects from that as well. And infrastructure, that's kind of the last hard system. And there you're looking at roads, electricity, water and sanitation, all your core things that make up the development process. In addition to those, well, I guess I didn't mention education, I normally mention that too. We have an incredibly detailed education model. Grade by grade, girls and boys, primary, secondary. Like USAID used to always be very interested in that kind of stuff, right? Like how much money should we be spending to keep kids in school versus improve the quality, and what are the trade-offs and the long-term implications for labor, et cetera. And then the areas where we're truly unique is this international relations governance space. We all know that governance matters a lot for development outcomes. I mean, if you have poor governance, it trickles down in lots of ways. Trust in society, ability to invest, right? Rule of law, corruption, all these kinds of issues can be really big challenges. One of the big through lines in our conversations with African leaders is governance and its significance. And then international relations, I mentioned earlier. So there you're looking at things like the threat of international conflict, diplomacy between countries, and then things that you probably, I don't know if you would have guessed they existed or not, but most people don't know because we're the only people who really develop it. It's looking at patterns of influence. So how much influence does one country have over another, and how does that change across time? And I'm happy to talk about any of that if you're interested. We do this for 188 countries, and so we're doing this for the world, and then those countries interact with each other. So they interact through patterns of trade, migration, remittances, ODA, investment, go down the list. So what you end up with in a tool like this is I think the best way to get your head around what the tool's actually doing. This is a visual representation of the structure of the tool for one country. So if you really wanted to think about this for the whole model, you'd multiply this by 188, and they would all be interacting. Each of these dots is a different variable in the tool, and each of the dots has a relationship with other dots. So the tool operates from a systems orientation. So you're thinking about what causes a change in, say, a demographic system. You have fertility rates that change, you have migration that changes, and then you have things like mortality that changes. All of those things themselves have drivers. So if we look at this, let's look at TFR, the total fertility rate. So this would be the total fertility rate in the model as we calculate it. And if I'm only looking at the things that drive the total fertility rate, you have issues up, you have things in the pink, this health system. So there are a variety of different ways of thinking about fertility rates, aging, peak aging, infant mortality, etc. You have other things down here like, whoops, I moved to a different variable. You have things like contraception use affecting fertility rate, right? You have the actual population size affecting fertility rate. The more people, the more babies you can have in an absolute term, not as a rate. Age of marriage is an important factor, for example. And then fertility rate itself has forward effects on things like births. And births have effects on things like the total population size. And when you look at something like total population size, it has a really strong relationship with lots of other variables in the model. The argument that demographics is destiny isn't exactly right, but there's some rhyme to it that makes quite a bit of sense. So this is the structure of the tool that we're looking at. And if you're interested in questions related to SDG 9, you can look at things like that we have in the manufacturing side of the tool. And you can go in and start to look at how consumption related to manufacturing is affecting other variables and relationships within the model itself. That's the foundation of where we're starting. Yes, please.
So what methodology do you use to actually estimate these relations? Is it a statistical base or is it a...
So some of it's like, let's look. So this is the tool itself. This is the IFS tool. One way we think about these relationships is on a certain level incredibly simplistic. I'll go back to the fertility rate again. And let's pick the fertility rate for 2015. And let's pick years of education for women in 2015. So on a level, we're looking at some simplistic relationships. So this is, as you see more average years of education for women, you see fertility rates reduce. You could put this into a model in this kind of very simplistic form, and it would do fine, but it's not where you would end an inquiry like this. But some of the kind of work we're doing is simply looking at how countries have developed across time and space and simple kinds of relationships. From there, you build the complexity, and you build the complexity based on two factors. One, I think one unique thing that we do analytically is we go between deductive quantitative analysis and inductive. So deductive is you're starting with ideas and you're doing your theory first, your concept first. Inductive is what machine learning does. You throw the kitchen sink at it and you try to have it predict an outcome. You don't really care what the relationships are as long as the prediction's good, right? So what we tend to do is go back and forth. So you start, what does the literature say drives changes in fertility rates? How do other people model this? And then you say, what is the statistical relationship? Then you go back to the literature. You iterate back and forth. And that's how you start to build some of these relationships. But that's only kind of a subset of relationships. There are other relationships in a tool like this that would be equilibrating. Has anyone here ever done economic modeling? God forbid.
That's why I asked.
A little bit?
Yeah.
So you would know about equilibrating systems. Supply, demand, price, right? Supply increases, demand stays the same, price goes down, right? So how do you model those kinds of systems? And there are a number of engineering techniques that you can use to get at more of an equilibrating system across time. There are other techniques that are related to like accounting systems. So very basically, I mentioned population systems, demography. Let's look at demography and education overlaid together. And let's pick our friends in Iran. So this would be Iran's population distribution. A lot of people don't recognize how old Iran is, actually. In the 80s, Iran did something pretty remarkable. They kind of followed China's lead and really set some draconian fertility rate policies that the Ayatollah was very much involved in. The UN population division was very involved in this as well. And so their population reduction thing happens here about 35 to 39 years ago, right? So that's your mid-80s period. And there you see a rapid reduction in the number of people. And then you see this come back. That's called an echo, because these people are having these people, right? That's how you can read these demographic tables. And then the colors are representing your educational attainment. So for women and men, what level of schooling have you completed? Primary, secondary, tertiary, right? So the red would be people who haven't completed primary. You can see a real gender imbalance in the older generations there, or a sex imbalance, I should say. These are not gender data, they're sex data, though that is a messy topic. Primary only, there's a lot of people there. Secondary only, and then tertiary, right? So how would we think about modeling this kind of a relationship? You would use some of those kinds of econometric cross-sectional relationships to get at the quantification between things like government spending and enrollment, etc. But a lot of this is also accounting. You're accounting for people as they're moving through systems, and so that's a totally different kind of quantitative approach that has a different history, etc. So what we're trying to do is bring all the world's best knowledge together in one place to create one tool that we can use from a policy or research perspective or a layperson perspective to democratize knowledge about the future. That's kind of the long-term objective that the founder of the Institute had and that I'm trying to continue. So that's why we like to have these conversations with people, so that you get to know what we're doing, and then you can see if you have any interest in playing around with this kind of a tool and learning about it. Any questions at this point? There's a lot of information. Yeah.
And you may have addressed this and I didn't hear it.
That's fine.
I don't hear well. But students attending the university like DU,
Yeah.
can they be involved in this as a supplemental or internship for credit with whatever else they're studying, or are they totally a part of just this program?
Oh, no. They're students with So most of the students we would employ would be students at the School of International Studies,
Okay,
and they would be undergrad or grad students there. And then there are different kinds of tiers. We employ a lot of students, anywhere between like 70 and 90 a year we would employ. The majority of those students are doing data building. So data building, I'll give you an example. We have a whole project on where heads of states travel. So where do heads of government and state travel when they go abroad, and why? So that's coding by hand.
so do any of these students get outside of the arena and are a part of something going on out there, a specific target subject, or not?
By outside the arena, do you mean in the policy space?
No, I mean what we've done with some of the students, international students, is there's one part of a topic, but they must be engaged in the community where the university exists, or outside of that, depending on travel availability and that kind of thing. But as a part of the internship, they have to be out there somewhere, seeing it actually taking place, not just in the closed arena.
Yeah. People who are building data, it's kind of a lighter commitment between us and them, so they don't. But we have people who are fellows, that they go deeper into learning about the resources, like what I'm showing you here, and then they use them. And typically, they use them, they're parts of projects where we work with like the UN. So if we had a project with the UN, we would bring students on, and then they would be in the room having conversations. I mean, they're not leading any of these conversations. They're able to get some experience, and then some do internships abroad, and some do internships at the UN and that kind of stuff. But I will reinforce, these days that doesn't exist. The UN's going through an incredible trend. We haven't had a UN project a new contract since March of last year. And we would normally have like 3 to 6 ongoing at any given point in time. And it's just, the new SecGen is coming on this summer. The UNDP had a new administrator start this last fall, which was later than they would have wanted. They're moving a lot of offices, a lot of people moving out of New York, Madrid, Vienna, Geneva, Nairobi kind of thing. So no, we're just decimated at the moment, yeah.
How do you control for data quality by country? Or even within country? For example, in the US, data quality by state differs significantly. So how do you control for that?
North Korea doesn't look very good for this visualization, right? Now I actually don't know if North Korea, what an actual North Korean would say about this. Like, these would be statistics that would be through UNESCO, right? And they would not have anything to do with the quality of the education. This is just like, did people sit in seats long enough to get accredited at the high school level, right? So data quality is an issue in so many different kinds of ways, as you're suggesting. One, every model suffers from garbage in, garbage out, right? So that's a fundamental kind of thing you're always struggling with. You do have to bring data in if you're going to measure North Korea that you know will not be the level of robustness that you'd want. But you also have data issues in very high income countries where, I'll give you an example. In the Netherlands, incredible data country, right? Like, trust the statistics, really, really well done. But in an ag model, like the one you would use in a tool like this, you would have agricultural production, like total crop production. You would have an estimate of your total calories that would result in. You'd have an estimate of the average yield and the land under cultivation. So if in North Korea I don't have one of those, I can calculate the others. But in the Netherlands, I have all of them and they don't reconcile. So in that sense, like, you trust it. It's not going to be as, deeply insecure as this kind of information, but you do have to think about like the data quality issue, even in data-rich countries. And sometimes having too much data can be a challenge in a different kind of way as well. So how would you use something like this? For me, models are all about, like, it depends. The application of the tool is how you should evaluate the data quality question. If I'm using this model to make a global analysis of something like reshoring of manufacturing, I don't really care about North Korea so much. If I'm building a model of like actual educational outcomes in North Korea, I'm gonna be very skeptical about, right, this, and what, this doesn't look right to me. It looks like it's really kind of made up data, or data that's not measuring what I would expect it to. But it's a never-ending challenge, you know. Yeah, we live by the old, you guys all, have you ever heard of the George Box quote, all models are wrong, but some are useful? Yeah, like we live by that. Like, we're not here to be like, we solved it, we're predicting it, we got it all done. No, models are meant to help us build understanding and have shared conversations that can shape all of the mental models that we have in different ways, to either find alignments or to help us understand disagreements, right? Like, that's what models should be used for. Models shouldn't be used as magic prediction machines where we don't understand or think about the causality in serious ways. Yes, ma'am?
So when somebody throws you a curveball like the one in Iran, how much is that gonna throw off your models?
So a curveball like attacking Iran?
Yeah, it's gonna impact these models, but to what extent?
I think it's a for what question, right? So like, when Russia invaded Ukraine, a bunch of people asked us, well, what's gonna happen? When they were asking us, it was a month after the invasion, and we said, we're not gonna get into that because it's too soon. You're asking us to say something too specific about something too uncertain. So that's one kind of way to think about how you would use a tool like this to respond to something like that. And I'll get to exactly what you're saying, but I'm going around in a couple of ways. Alternatively, if someone said to us, hey, what are some scenarios about China attacking Taiwan? Would you model a variety of these? Sure, no problem. Like that's I think how models should be used. We think about broader implications to help decision makers tease out uncertainties and that kind of stuff. On the actual invasion of Iran right now, there are two ways to think about this, and I think it relates to what end are you using tools like this. If you're using a tool like this to say, the Middle East development trajectory for the next 30 years is going to look like this, and I will predict that for you, which I could show you predictions of. You shouldn't do that. I wouldn't use it in that kind of sense. But alternatively, you can do what if. Well, what if Iran's GDP fell by X% this year? What if we assume 30% of their infrastructure got destroyed? What if we assume that they can't produce energy for a number of years? Like, there are a whole bunch of what ifs. The tool's called ifs, right? International futures. We're interested in asking those what ifs. That can help you think through the implications of what's happening now. And I could show you how to do that in a tool like this. Like, you can build really elaborate what if kinds of scenarios. It gets complicated. And so if you actually want to do that, you have to invest enough in learning how to navigate some of the messiness. But that's how you would want to think about using it. One other thing I would want to say in response to this, I think very often we suffer from short-termism that's debilitating. And that short-termism says, when I'm not saying you, I'm not trying to pick on you, I'm saying collective, right? When I'm seeing the New York Times and we're attacking Iran and this, that, and the other thing, immediately we go to the entire world's different. The entire world has changed. And I think that's partially a product of how a for-profit media environment helps incentivize us to get amped up with all the things we're seeing all the time without asking us to contextualize whether short-term changes are really having long-term impacts, or whether we're doing but they might. It could be really bad, it could be, right? As opposed to, what is the actual long-term implication geopolitically or for whatever you're interested in for the attack on Iran? For example, if we go back to Iran here, this won't change. Nothing here will change. How many people have been killed in Iran so far? About 2,000 is the estimates I've heard. Awful tragedy. I'm Mennonite pacifist, so like personally, like big opponent, right? But analytically, which is no one wants a pacifist to provide analysis because they have simple answers to things. But if I put my analytic hat on, this doesn't change, right? So what are the things that change, and how do we think about what those changes might mean, and how do we think about the continuity in addition to the change? Said another way, if you take models like these and run them historically, like if I start a model like this and run it in 1990 and run it to 2025, how far off am I in terms of global population? 2%? 3%? It's about that. Not bad. Do you know how many things have happened since 1990? We could list a few of the things that we woke up and read in the paper and said, holy shit, this is, right? So contextualizing the bad or the change within the continuity is one thing we try to do. It's not to say that I can probably very easily sound glib about the attack on Iran and the implications, right? And I'm not trying to be. I am trying, though, to say that very often we get stuck in these patterns of short-termism, and we need to contextualize that with long-term continuity. Yeah.
Do you have follow-up results with action steps put into, I mean, because to me that, you have all of these predictions, but, where are the results?
The results in terms of what? Like what we would tell a policymaker?
Well, just steps that one would take, like say in Iran, if they wanted it, what steps would they take to increase the education?
Oh, okay.
Because of the predictions you're making.
Well, what I'm showing here, I wouldn't even call it prediction. I would call this a good estimate of educational attainment and population. I don't think this is uncertain.
Sure.
This is,
okay.
Iran's not a data, it's not North Korea.
You've got the data from the research.
Right.
Yeah.
So now if I go forward, I go to 2025, let's go to 2030, go to 2040, we'll go to how far out do we want to go? Let's go to 2060. This is a prediction, right? And what's moving? Lots of stuff's moving. Remember the echo? This is the echo. This is that generation from the early 80s that started to see their fertility rates reduce. Then you have an echo, and the echo is much more muted. Why is this next echo muted? Because fertility rates are incredibly low in Iran, right? I'll show you that. It's interesting. But then you have educational attainment. We're assuming that you have full primary. This could be something that's affected by what's happening in Iran now. Let's say like we get a tripling down of hardline theocracy, whatever. Like you could maybe imagine this desire for full primary to be eroded a bit, but I would be skeptical. Like even if you look at a place, let's look at Afghanistan. This is Afghanistan in 2060. I mean, first of all, look how optimistic this is. Real huge gender imbalance here. The long-term trend in primary enrollment and secondary and tertiary, the gender imbalance is girls in favor of boys, right? So that's what this kind of thing is picking up on over a long-term trajectory. Do I buy that? Do I not? Right? It's helping us think about the understanding and the causal mechanism.
What's their fertility rate?
At this point, you can see it's still above 2.1 because their population is still expanding. Let's look at fertility rates. It's come up a few times, so let's pick a few. I'm gonna pick, this is the main kind of thing that people use when they use the tool, this display. It's not the sexiest thing, but it gives you a lot of flexibility. I'll pick China, I'll pick Iran, we mentioned Afghanistan, I'll pick a notorious high country, Niger, and let's pick the US. Anyone else?
Uganda?
Uganda, be kidding me. Thank you, Uganda. I've done a lot of Uganda work, and that joke doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. So China, the green, comes down here, right? The one-child policy, one-child policies don't happen until a little later. Like, I used to be mistaken about this. A lot of the transition in Chinese fertility rate was before the 2 and 1 child policy, and it was urbanization, and it was like the post-Mao leap forward kinds of things that had a cultural shift. This was the Ayatollah. So here's your Shah, Ayatollah transition, and then you see this rapid reduction. This kind of rapid reduction is not natural. There's a big cultural policy shift when those kinds of things happen. If you put like an India up there, India's comes down like this. India's is like much more natural in terms of its reduction, like without exogenous interference. The US, down here at the bottom, 2.1 is replacement. So basically, if you have 2.1 for many years, your population will flatten, right? And that's what replacement generally means, though it's a theoretical thing, it's not a real thing. And yeah, you got your Uganda, Afghanistan, Niger at the top there. And those are some of your more complicated situations. This is a hugely important driver of long-term change. I'll give you an example. We don't factor these kinds of things in when we're making policy, and we really need to. Let's look at population just size. And let's look at it for a group I like that looks like. So this is, the green is Africa. Now, Africa's not a country, but the African Union wants it to be. And so sometimes we represent it as a country. 55 member states is what we would represent here. So we could break it down if we want, but let's just make it a country. China up here, India, the EU, and the US. I'm gonna do this thing where I go percent of total, and I'm gonna make it a percentage. A percent of the total distribution. So, of these groups, let's just pretend it's the world because that's just easier. It's not the world, we're missing quite a bit. But China had 35% of these groups' population in 1960, and the EU was 20%. 1 in 5 people were European. Today, you see this interesting kind of crossover between India, China, and Africa. But they're all on very different trajectories, right? By 2050, 2 in 5 people will be African. That's not a lot of uncertainty. That's like baked into the cards, right? And that's not something our policymakers care about in the least. If you did, you would have a robust engagement strategy with the continent that would prioritize development, sustainability, et cetera. Yeah.
No, sorry, I just heard on BBC that the British are cutting off general aid Africa and just gonna focus on conflict
There you go.
areas, so, yeah.
Wait, what did he say?
The British government decided not to, and they've been, you probably know better, funding a lot of development assistance to Africa. They're
Yeah.
ending it and just gonna focus on conflict areas, which, man,
Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty,
Yeah.
Very bad.
The development assistance world has been decimated. Like the loss of USAID, we used to do $300-400 grand a year with USAID research for their different, like where they should be putting money. You put it more in education, you put more in, we did a huge thing in Uganda where Obama started this thing for USAID where every mission had to do a 5-year plan. I guess it makes him sound like a communist. It was called a CDCS, a Country Development Coordination Strategy, where it was like for these 5 years, USAID is putting our money in these buckets. And our work changed one of their buckets, one of their 3 buckets, and replaced one, and it was all about family planning. Because in Uganda, like, it's not simply, population growth isn't neutral. Population growth has costs and implications for lots of things. So if we look at Uganda and the total population size, I'm gonna go crazy. Let's go out to 2100. You're going from a population in 1960 of 8 million people. That's a couple million more than the entire state of Colorado. To today, 55 million. That's pretty dramatic. From 8 to 80, that's a 80-year shift. And then you double it again almost by the end of the century. And these are not like, it would take a lot of policy change to have this thing shift in a dramatic way, yeah.
What about development change?
Said it-
Development change, what if the
Huge.
incomes go up?
Yes, that's
So
okay.
Would that flatten the curve?
Oh,
If incomes went up a lot?
let me do this now. This is a good time because we're starting to get into some what ifs. And I could run scenarios on my computer, but it just takes a while to run a whole scenario. So if I introduce this conversation by introducing these 5 scenarios, it'll give us a way to tackle a range of different questions you might have. These are the SSPs, which you know about. I'm going to give you a brief crash course in climate model stuff. If you're forecasting global emissions to 2100, what do you need as an input? You need greenhouse gases, you need emissions, right? You need how they build up in the atmosphere. Well, how do you get to how much energy we're consuming and how good we are at consuming it? You need scenarios that capture the socioeconomic side of things. You need to know how many people there are. You need to know how fat and sassy they are. You need to know how much energy they consume, of what kind. Without that information, you're just completely making stuff up on the climate side of things. So what the IPCC is the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's the body that has the mandate to assess the science related to climate change every X number of years. They're in the middle of AR7 now, which is the next one. Will come out in a couple years. And what those exercises are oriented towards, well, let me say this. The IPCC took a decision about 15 years ago to say that the scenarios that represent the future of socioeconomic development should be determined by the scenario community. And so that's people like me. And so the community, I didn't create these because I was a grad student when these were created. But the community created these scenarios that were meant to be the backbone for thinking about how the socioeconomic development side of things will affect long-term climate change. But you can use them for a lot of other things. So there are 5 worlds, and they're organized along 2 axes. This first axis, I think, is the easiest to understand. This is challenges for mitigation. How hard is it to keep greenhouse gases in the ground, right? Is it easy, or is it really, really hard? So if you're down here, sustainability, it's not hard at all. We have policies, people are choosing to live hippy-dippy, like we're not consuming a lot, fewer people, etc. If you're up here, you are just drill baby drill, right? Coal, 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 that's this. So lots of emissions, very few emissions. This axis is different. This is how hard is it for us to adapt to climate change. So on a day like this, not so hard. Right? It's a beautiful day, right? It's too beautiful in many ways. What would make it hard for you to adapt to climate change, right? It would be hard if you didn't have money. It'd be hard if you lived outside. It'd be hard if you didn't have information. It'd be hard if you couldn't read. It'd be hard if you were sick and you just were unable to even kind of deal with this. So this axis is about how developed are we? Are we very developed? Or are we very poorly developed, okay? So whenever you look at 2x2s, there's one axis this way that looks good and one that's confusing. It's almost always the case. The one that looks good is this. This makes all the sense in the world. One is we are doing great. This is, the Boulder City Council would vote for this world in a heartbeat. It would be like controlled policy. We're not going to emit much. We're going to make sure development standards are good. Like, even going through this library, it's like, oh wow, what a thoughtful this, and this, right? That's the kind of world. It's not going to have as much growth as other worlds. It's not going to have as many billionaires, stuff like that. But we can weather both the climate side and the development side. This world is kind of the path we're on. This is a world where it's about 3 degrees centigrade climate, 3 degrees centigrade temperature change, right? Like that's the kind of, it's like if we're not doing anything, that's the path we're on. This world might be the path forward. Some people say we're on this path, and it's a very violent world. It's a world where there's a lot of money spent on the military. It's a world where decision-making is capricious and bad. It sounds familiar to this, right, today. This other axis is very different. This world up here is a world where people are really rich, but there's like a lot of climate change, right? Like you're talking about extreme climate change. You're talking about parts of the world that are uninhabitable, that kind of thing. But people live in their air-conditioned kind of whatever. Most people think this is the least likely world of any of them, right? Because to get there, you have to burn more fossil fuels than makes sense based on the localized environmental issues. Like when China was developing with coal, you could go crazy with coal, but at a certain point, your water really ends up suffering, your local air ends up suffering. So it's just hard to understand how you get there. This is the world I wanted to bring up based on the SDG 9 conversation of reshoring. So this SSP4 world is a world where we have problems adapting. Not everyone, but a large chunk of people have problems adapting. And one of the reasons is because of this question of reshoring, manufacturing, and the idea that in the global north, we have so much capital that we can say, okay, we're gonna bring all of this technology back to the global north, and we're gonna re-incentivize manufacturing in a big way. We may pretend that that's going to be done by humans, but it's not. If you look at the relationship between labor productivity, manufacturing in the global north, like technology has completely undermined the ability of people to actually do this. It's a labor, it's a robotics, AI, automated kind of process thing. So we're not doing this in a heavily labor-oriented way, even though politicians might claim that. It's, I think, one of the biggest, most obvious lies that's out there. But if you do take that manufacturing and you do not give countries the ability to step through the development pipeline, going from your agricultural production to something like manufacturing to something like services, then the big question is, and I don't think anyone knows what's right or wrong in this space, but the big question is, does that completely undermine the ability of the global south to develop? And in a world like this, you have global divergence. And that's the big idea I wanted to make sure we put out there. In economics, you often talk about convergence. Convergence is Nigeria can grow. China's a better example. China joins the WTO. We start putting a bunch of manufacturing plants in China. What does China do? China goes, oh, how did you make that? Oh, why do you put it on a pallet? You standardize the... Has anyone ever seen how Russia moves artillery shells? They pick one up. Right? There's a lack of standardization in some processes like that, right? Like, you learn from seeing. It's easy to converge your productivity towards someone who's doing it really well. If I see a colleague of mine who's like doing something better than I am, and I go, how did you do that? You read that paper in 1 hour? What'd you do? And they said, oh, actually, you use this one tool and it'll summarize whatever. Like, that's convergence. In a world of significant reshoring, a scenario like this argues that that convergence starts to stop. And you end up, and if I show you, like India is a great example. These are the different worlds, the 5 worlds I mentioned, SSP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if we look at India for GDP per capita, we'll go to 2050. We'll tighten up here a little bit. Okay. The best world for India is this sustainable development world. that SSP1, the bottom left. And the reason it's the best is there's a lot of development assistance that's happening in that direction. India is lowering their fertility rates. They're investing in education and health outcomes. Like the things are firing to meet the SDGs. The second best world for this measure, GDP per capita, is SSP5. That's the top world over here I said was really unlikely. That's drill baby drill. There's a lot of growth there, right? You can grow like crazy. The second best world is this middle of the road, the third best, the path that we're on. And then the bottom two are these two really sad scenarios, the inequality scenario and the conflict scenario. Now, in all of these worlds, India grows a little bit from where they are today. So to your point, this development thing is still happening. The development story is incredible, and we don't talk about it enough, right? We're not talking about the bottom billion anymore. It's the bottom 700 million kind of thing, right? So these things are shifting in really important ways. But these kinds of scenarios that have a reshoring implication, like I'll show you for poverty. Let's look at poverty. Look at poverty in India. Oops. Oh, see, India's doing really well in this measure of poverty. Let's pick a higher threshold. Pick a higher threshold. 830. So here are your different worlds for India. Notice so 830. How many of you know, I don't want to put people on the spot, currency years? So these are in 2021 dollars, which was a value of $1 in 2021. Remember back in the day, it was like people who live on less than $1 a day? Then it became like $1.25, $1.50, $1 whatever, right? It's because the currency, the threshold's the same. Theoretically, it's the same. The threshold's the same, but then the value changes because we're using different years to track what the inflation level is. So 830 is not extreme poverty, it's more moderate poverty from a development perspective. And you can see it still gets better in all these worlds, but this inequality world is much worse. Yeah.
So if we take any of these scenarios, but particularly let's say the reshoring scenario, to what extent is that just market driven, or is it the result of explicit policies?
In the actual structure of the scenario, I think it's a bit ambivalent in terms of how these scenarios in particular are created. These scenarios are created from a narrative first. So the scientists get together and say, here's the story, and then people like me turn them into numbers. And I don't have to make a choice about whether it's market-driven or policy-driven for the question of divergence or convergence. I simply have to make an assumption that there's some lack of technology transfer between global systems leaders and others. In the work that I've done looking at this with people in Africa who care a lot about this kind of thing, you have two totally different camps. One is it has to be policy-driven promotion of manufacturing for Africa to develop, right. and that's a policy-driven thing to avoid the market-driven thing. But it's kind of, I haven't been doing this in Africa since this most recent version of Trump, where he's very clearly trying to turn the screws on the policy-driven side of reshoring in the global north, but then with the misstatement about how that could be really incentivizing manufacturing labor in a space like that, which I think is largely bogus. I don't know if that.
Yeah, and the inequality that you're emphasizing is across countries, right, or across continents. But there's also, how does inequality within countries change, or have I misinterpreted that?
No, you're exactly right. That's a totally different piece of the pie, and that's another thing that we're looking at as well. the economy, distribution, so the Gini. So you have issues related to what is the within country distribution of income, right? And this would be what the scenarios would suggest. So the most unequal is this unequal world, both within India and across. You'll still have people cutting into their cosmopolitan relationships with the global north and getting rich. But then you also have a cross-country inequality as well that is significant. So, said another, let me show you the...
You show the US?
Sure. It's not a dissimilar story.
It's been going up, yeah, that's
Whoops.
since 1980,
Yeah. No, I mean, this is the other thing too. People care a lot about this measure, and I think they actually don't. What Marx called false consciousness. No, I don't think that. I think the truth, people care about inequality, but I think people care first about deprivation. People don't want people to be deeply, deeply suffering. And then a measure like this, the Gini coefficient, which I don't know how many people are familiar, but let me show you how it's calculated. Because I think it'll give you some insights. Let's do, where the heck is that? Growth, here it is. Lorenz curve, do HC. No, do this. And we're going to add curves. So this is an argument about global inequality, just for the base case. These aren't 5 different scenarios. The way you calculate a Gini coefficient for income in particular is this thing called a Lorenz curve, where the green line is the line of perfect equality, where 50% of the population has 50% of the resource. So this argues that 50% of the global population has about, I don't know, what is that, 10%? Yeah, about 10% of global GDP per capita, if you thought that was a proxy for income. It's not, but for this example, it's fine. And then you have the world becoming, from 2022 to 2052, more equal in terms of the global distribution of income, right? And it is this part of the distribution that grows. It's this upper middle class kind of version of global income where you see the growth. Everyone else basically stagnates where they are in terms of the distribution of these resources. So the reason I don't like this as a measure, if you put a lot of weight on it, is because you can have changes at so many different levels of the population that it conflates so many things in one space. It's hard to know analytically what to do with it. That's a tangent on inequality. But if we did that for this bad scenario, I don't know if it'll work, but we can try because this might have a bug. This is this reshoring scenario. Okay, let's add curves. Yeah, you see less convergence here, though you do see a little. Yeah. So even in these bad scenarios, it's not predicting. Everything falls apart. Everything becomes disastrous. And I think there's really good reasons why. There are really good reasons why. Has anyone ever heard of the distinction between stocks and flows in a systems modeling framework? Yeah. Okay, stocks and flows, this is like So why do I think the world's way more predictable at a macro level than most people? Because of stocks and flows, and equilibrating systems, but it's largely stocks and flows. Come January 1st next year, what will the US population be? It doesn't start at 0, right? It doesn't. It starts at 300 and some million people, right? Because it's a stock. It changes slowly. What's a flow? What's an example of a flow? GDP. GDP, January 1st, starts at 0. It's not a stock. And then what do we care about? The growth of GDP. So we care about the growth, the derivative on the flow, which is silly. What would the equivalent be in a demographic system? It would be like the percent change on the fertility rate each year. It would be like the fertility rate went up by, it would be a silly thing to think about, or at least a thing that would be narrowly applicable. But for us, GDP growth is like the end all. But what is that? It's the output of a huge number of systems that have stocks at their base. What are the stocks in the economy? What are the things we don't have to reproduce every year? Roads? Capital. We don't have to go, it's January 1st, buy some new tables and chairs for this room again. You know what I mean? No, because they exist, they persist. At a certain point they deteriorate, but not for a while. What else? Labor. Labor is another kind of thing that you don't have to rebuild your labor supply every year. And what's the third thing? And this is the one that ties into this SDG 9 in a big way, is technology. What is technology? It's human knowledge embedded in machines, basically, or human knowledge embedded in processes that are reproducible. So if we can take the technology that exists in like a large language model and in robotics and use that as a way to help change how our economy works, that becomes a stock that then leads to the production and the consumption that becomes GDP, and then we tend to care about the growth rate on that GDP. Or as like NPR would do it in their most infuriating segment from my perspective, by the numbers. They say the S&P is up 12 points today. I couldn't tell you anything that mattered less than the day-on change in the S&P for understanding anything about the world, really, unless it changed by like 5%. And then you'd go, oh, something might have happened. But it still isn't going to undermine the entire stock of everything that we have. And the problem is, in the Global South, there aren't the stocks of capital that you can use to do what we do, to live pretty fat and sassy in our lives here, and then to have resources that we can invest and get returns from. If you don't have that, you need labor to build that. And if labor isn't able to build that to export it, you can't sell things to poor people to make enough money to not be poor. If you're a cassava farmer and you're selling cassavas to the guy down the street, you can subsist, but you're not going to get rich in that kind of space. You're not going to be able to accumulate the capital that allows you to escape this kind of poverty trap or this vicious cycle of poverty. So how do you build the stocks of the things that matter for the economy in the Global South if all the people who want to buy cheap nonsense, people in the West, are able to produce it in their robot factories that sit right next to DIA, and we go to Amazon and we say we need a chair, and the robot factory prints us a chair, or whatever will happen in 5 years, and a drone sends it to us. Labor is totally removed from that process. And who gets rich? The people who have capital, right? Because capital will win at the end.
So what's our way out of that?
What?
What's our way out of that?
Oh, I have no idea. I have zero idea.
Earlier you talked about how these models are being used with the UNDP for some of their decision making. Curious if there's any other stakeholders that have expressed interest in this, or if there's a vision for other stakeholders using these models.
I mean, who uses this? People in a variety of governments, people in a variety of international organizations. It normally goes like this, like, you'll have a political party come in. Peru, we had this happen, where we were part of their analytics team for like 5 years, and then they got voted out, and so that changes. Or think tanks, there are a bunch of think tanks that use these kinds of tools to do their own analysis. Professors, researchers, grad students, lay people, right? In the UN, the closest thing we did to this SDG 7 was UNIDO. UNIDO is the United Nations, what is it?
Industrial development.
Thank you. It is somewhere here. Yeah, the Industrial Development Report. Yeah, we contributed to this last year. And so, like, there's a lot of reports. There's a lot of briefings to decision makers, like about if we prioritize health spending over education or family planning, here are trade-offs, right? That kind of stuff. Yes, ma'am.
Within the UN SDGs, they obviously water and sanitation are huge.
Yeah.
They're not going to reach their goals by 2030. What can you put in this system that would give us an idea of what would happen if water access increased by X number of percentage and sanitation to low open defecation?
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing this does. I mean, that's an easy thing to do in this. So infrastructure, water and sanitation, there's so many different ways of cutting into it. Like if we just did the 3 broad categories. We have other models that do 5 categories, urban, rural kinds of things. This was all funded by USAID back when it was alive. And so what you can do is you can choose the policy that you would like to see. Like, are you looking at OD, like development assistance funding it, domestic governments, and so there are trade-offs, or like what level, that kind of thing. And then this will have forward linkages to other outcomes. So if I type in here, sanitation, this is like the relationship between sanitation and other outcomes in the system. So these are the forward linkages. It would have connections to other systems, and then and some of these would have connections to health outcomes, for example. So you would have you'd have connections to like communicable disease outcomes. We've done a ton of stuff, and like I think the very first policy brief I did was called Taps and Toilets, back in 2011, back when I was a grad student. And it was like, how can improved access to water and sanitation transform development in Africa? And in so many ways, it's a no-brainer. Like, as it's clear that you know, yeah, it has a huge effect, especially the most basic level of access. And it's an issue because of communicable diseases. It's an issue because of productivity, but it's also an issue because of stuff that like I wouldn't have thought of as a cisgendered white guy, like sexual violence. Like if you're going to the restroom in the bush at night, like that's a huge predatory opportunity for someone who might be lurking, kind of thing. And there's like a lot of studies in that space too. So yeah, it has a big trend, and it's cheap too. It's not an expensive intervention. Why don't we do it? Political will, governance, you need the other kinds of things too, like roads to get there, who maintains it. I mean, all the standard challenges of development that have existed, you know, since people have been trying to do development work. Yes, ma'am.
I'm thinking just lately, of course, of the complete destruction of Gaza and now Lebanon and now Iran and the displacement of 6 million people. This is equivalent to 6 million Jews getting killed in World War II. So that 6 million displacement of people, you can just throw in robots and rebuild whole countries, and what if ultimately it goes to atomic bombs, and then the compounding of that on the climate change.
Oh yeah.
From
You've been having some bad dreams, right?
well, unfortunately, they're not dreams.
No. They're not dreams at all. There are awful things happening in the world, like truly. So how would we think about that kind of a question? You could build a scenario about Iran that looked at different destruction paths and how it was kind of recovering. There's also interesting stuff you could do by thinking about like, who has the most influence over Iran? So if you're trying to think about policies and strategies, right? One thing I do with students is I say, okay, if I said to you, who had the most influence over Iran, in your head, pick a country or two. Like,
Sure.
right? Whenever you look at a graph, I think you should always try to imagine what it looks like in your head and then evaluate whether you were close or not. Not that it's right or wrong, but it allows you to compare your mental model with another model. And I think that can be really valuable. So this is a measure that looks at influence as Trump really uses this kind of thinking. And these measures are used in the US intelligence community and stuff like this too. So who knows? I don't have a clearance, so I'm not involved in any of those conversations. But it's a measure that looks at how dependent you are on someone else for your economy and your security and basically politics. And so a country that's incredibly heavily dependent, like the top value in this data set is Russia's influence over Belarus, right? It's basically a client state of Russia, right? The US has the most influence over Mexico, Canada, right? And then you can go from there. It takes a second to load because it's got to go through a data processing thing. So the scale is 0, no influence, 1, Russia on Belarus. And so you can see that Iran doesn't have a lot of external influence that gets it close to a 1. Who's that back in the day? USA. That's a good old Shah, and then we trickle off, and here comes China. And now you got China and Russia. But how much influence is that? So 0.18, let's look at the equivalent US. Who does the US have influence over at that like 0.18 kind of level? I don't know the answer. I'm not. But this is the kind of thing a tool like this should be used for. You're exploring, you're thinking, you're trying to understand the longer term perspective in spite of all the short term awfulness that's happening, right? Yeah, 6 million displaced people is awful.
This is the best video game ever. Okay, all right.
This is?
This is development one.
Oh no, this is influence over the US. I went the wrong way. So Canada has the most. Who has the most influence over the US at a 0.18? Germany. So China and Russia have as much influence over Iran as Germany has over the US. So you can contextualize this stuff. I know one, like, people talk back in the day about how much influence China had over North Korea. If you look at tools like these, the US has as much influence back in the day, so 5 years ago, over Venezuela as China had over North Korea, right? There's still economic flows between the countries. This is like, so the point of a tool like this, and what I think that we're trying to do, is help people understand what empirically seems to be more right to allow them to make decisions based on their kind of value consideration. So here's the US. Who does the US have influence over that's similar to China's influence over Russia? China's influence over Iran. We're in the Poland kind of space. The US has influence over Poland for sure. But like if you're contextualizing how much influence China and Russia have over Iran, it's a different way of thinking about it than simply being like, oh, they're the vassal state of China and of Russia. It's a much more complicated set of relationships than that. I know that's not at all what you're asking in terms of the human suffering side of all of these tragedies, Gaza being destroyed, etc. But a tool like this, I think, like I said, I'm a pacifist. I don't bring policymakers pacifist advice. My personal morality goes somewhere else. For this, our job is just to say what's empirically more accurate in a space like that. You could build scenarios that were trying to reflect some of the concerns you had about the world, but it would take quite a bit of effort. Yeah.
I was playing with this smartphone.
Yes.
And I use Perplexity as an AI.
Yeah.
And I've been able to replicate most of what you've put up here.
Have you really?
Yeah.
With ifs?
Yeah. Well, the difference is you have a base of scenarios.
Yeah.
Which is a very important tool.
Yeah.
And it's readily available.
But you're just
So
putting
for me
in
to replicate that on here would take forever.
Yeah. Awesome.
But the point is, my question is really more general.
Yeah.
To what extent has the development of AI apps
Yes.
influenced what you do, and in some ways allows people to do it themselves.
So I didn't know Perplexity did that with ifs, which is great. But the AI question, I have two answers to. One that's very concrete. I think AI will lead to a social science data creation revolution that no one's been thinking about, and people aren't really talking about. I'll give you an example. And I know I'm over time. If people have to leave, I'm not going to take any offense to people leaving. Let's see. Sorry, that's real quick. No, that's not it. Sorry, they moved these on me. What we did was oh, here it is. They're all next to each other. Silly me. The CIA created a measure of the number of countries in civil wars. And they spent tens of millions of dollars. Oh, that's the US. They spent tens of millions of dollars doing this. I'm very familiar with the project. There's another group called UCDP that if the scaling was right, it's messed up, follows a similar trajectory. And then this green line, the green line is the measure that we created using AI, right? And so it's a country level coding framework that is basically, I've worked for years with grad students coding stuff, where, you give them a template that you've worked a lot on. It has a set of coding rules. They go out there and they try to reproduce it and kind of follow the instructions. AI can do that really well for certain data sets. So I was able to reproduce this count of, you see how similar the blue and the green line are, right? The blue line cost tens of millions of dollars. The green line, the first time I made it on a flight from London to Denver. Like I figured out how to get it, and it was like R squared of like 0.9 something, and it was remarkably useful. So that's just reproducing what's been done. But if you're studying civil wars, what's an even more important thing to understand? How many people are affected in countries, not just the binary. Cambodia in the 70s was off the charts. Like India has civil wars all the time, and most of their population isn't affected. So you can start to, I don't know what this will look like, but yeah, this is ignore the forecast, but this is an estimate of the percent of the population globally that's affected by civil wars using an LLM to create it. It was never something, it was always a big gap in our analysis, our ability to capture this, because you need it as a driver of migration, you need it as a driver of development outcomes, you need it as a driver of lots of things. But so what we're able to do here is to look in a more granular way. If I pull up the countries, you'll see a little more of variability. We're able to make estimates of the percent of the population within different countries that are affected by civil war using a different framework, yeah.
So what was going on in the 90s that drove that?
It's the end of the Cold War. There are a lot of competing theories, but a lot of people would argue that it's a shift in the structure of the international system from bipolar to unipolar.
Okay.
So you have a bunch of
Breaking apart, things like that.
stuff like that, and you have just stuff that where the Soviets supported someone and then they stopped supporting them across time. And so this is all AI created. It's complicated. It's not like just create this, right? It's much messier. So that's one response. There's a ton of stuff we've been talking to people about in terms of things you could create using AI-related models. Because what is AI? AI is a model that's predicting the next word, and as a model, it's wrong, but it can be useful. So how do you think about where it's wrong and where it's useful? And so we're trying to do that with the knowledge bases that are behind it. So that's one answer. The other answer I think is way more interesting, and that's this. A neural network, that's the basis of all LLMs, and basically what it is it's an inductive approach to quantitative analysis where you put in a bunch of stuff, you try to map it to some outcome indicator, and you try to have the model just force it through iterations to get as close as possible. A tool like this, with all of these connections, and if you multiply this by 188, think about the hundreds of thousands of relationships, you can't calibrate that using statistical approaches that are traditional at all. It's too complex. Your uncertainty will go to positive and negative infinity like right away. But you could use a neural net structure to take inputs, run the model, compare the results of the model to historical data, and then change the inputs and iterate thousands of times. So I have computers in my office that are doing this thousands of times. And one of the things we're calibrating on are subsystems. Like this is demography, so we'll calibrate demography. How good can we get that historically? Then we'll say, okay, well, let's add demography and this is health. Let's do demography and health together. What are the overlapping or kind of confounding effects when you calibrate one or the other? And then how do you change the outcome indicators and what are the implications for this? I think if I do this right, we'll be able to say something much more concretely about the long-term future and like what kind of climate path we're on, right? Like, because right now climate paths look like this, for the most part. And policymakers, like our good friend Donald, can say, let's do temperature change. That was annual temperature. Temperature change here. Like if you're sitting on an understanding that these models are essentially simply wrong and the future is not knowable, then you can look in a future climate change space and say the uncertainty is massive. But if you had something that was broadly calibrated to a historical period of time, you can talk more concretely about narrowing the uncertainty and talking about the paths we're on, which I think, like, people on the left won't love so much because it's not going to be as scary as it could be, and people on the right won't love for sure because it'll show that we're on a path that's definitely not sustainable. So, but I think that's like, why not fight for the middle in a space like this? I don't know what's taking so long, but.
Where do you end up? You go north 3 degrees or south?
Well, it depends on which. I think we're north of 3 degrees.
Okay.
Yeah, we're 3. I think we're 3 point something by the end.
In what year?
What?
In what year?
I would guess 2060 or something. I don't know why it's taking so long.
That'll take longer.
Let me just do it again because it'll. It shouldn't take long.
So you're all right, Thomas.
It's overtime, it knows it's overtime, so it's cutting out.
Yeah. Yeah, there it is.
Okay.
So the blue line is our base. We get over 3 later in the center, basically 3 degrees.
And then level off.
And then the sustainable world, we peak in the 1.5s, and then in the bad worlds, it's all in the 4s. I don't think these are plausible.
Yeah.
Like it's the amount of, it's just implausible, I think, to burn that much fossil fuel to be able to get into a world. I mean, what's Boulder going to look like in March in 2070 in a world like this? You know what I mean?
This will be coming.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
well, sorry for all the meandering.
No, not at all.
But
I
thanks
think,
for hanging in there.
We just love to have you run these different scenarios and all the possibilities. It's really,
Well, supposedly
really
we're breaking
fascinating.
a 100-year record tomorrow or something with 88 degrees.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this week it was like in my Denver news was like 5 hottest days on record in 7 days,
Yeah.
in a 7-day stretch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.